Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Current Consulting Group and sponsored by DrugPak. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group, and I'll be conducting today's webinar presentation entitled Why Drug Testing Series Part 3, Navigating Legal Drug Use in the Workplace and Leveraging Smart Software Solutions. This presentation pre-qualifies for continuing education from SHRM, and you will receive information on how to access the information for those credits after today's presentation via email. Today's sponsor is DrugPak. We'd like to share with you just a little bit about our sponsor as we get started. DrugPak has been a trusted name in the industry for over 35 years. And when it first launched, it was the only comprehensive drug testing management software available. As the drug testing industry has evolved, so has DrugPak. At the forefront of innovation, DrugPak processes data faster and more efficiently by integrating directly with laboratories and MROs to help transform the way business is done in drug testing, making it easier for providers to deliver results to their clients. And we're going to spend some more time with learning about DrugPak later in our presentation, so I'm not going to take up too much of our time with that. But just as we mentioned before, this is the third part in a three-part series that DrugPak has sponsored. If you're interested in the recordings to the first two parts and have not had the opportunity to view those or would like to view them again, just let us know and we'll send you those links. Today's presentation will be presented by Jackie Perrone, who is Vice President of the Current Consulting Group. Jackie oversees CCG's comprehensive suite of marketing and brand promotion support services for drug testing and background screening providers. And she has 35 years of experience in the diagnostic industry, with the past 30 years focused on drug and alcohol testing. She served as the Senior Director at OraSure Technologies, where she spent 15 years leading the global direction of the drugs of abuse and risk assessment product lines. Prior to her time at OraSure, Jackie was the global marketing manager for the drug testing division at Roche Diagnostics, and she frequently presents at industry associations, meetings, webinars like this, end user conferences, as well as other drug and alcohol screening webinars. And so we're going to go ahead and mute me now and turn our slide presentation over to Jackie and let her get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. And again, a very big thanks to DrugPak for sponsoring today. I don't know how many of you were privy to parts 1 and parts 2. So as Jessica mentioned, if you have not and wanted to catch up on either one or both of those, please let us know and we'll be happy to send you out the recordings for those. So today, you can see the agenda. We're going to kind of talk, we're going to have 5 or 6 sections here. We're going to talk about the current landscape of legal drug use at the state and federal levels. We're going to focus a lot on marijuana today. While we'll talk about drug testing and drug use and the laws in general, a lot of what we're going to focus on is marijuana because that's one of the most fluid things that we're seeing, up and even including at the federal level with the Schedule 1 to 3 conversation, and we'll get into a little bit of that as well for you. We'll also talk about the top reasons to conduct marijuana testing, from pre-employment, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, random fitness for duty, and then kind of how that aligns with methodologies for each of these and why they matter. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the drug testing methodologies that are out there, not only urine, oral fluid, blood, hair, but we'll also talk a little bit about lab-based and point of care, so you kind of get a fuller picture. We'll also talk about how some states are responding to legalization and some considerations for your workplace policy. So anytime we talk about the laws and testing, we also kind of want to see how that dovetails with your policy. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then as Jessica mentioned at the end, we're going to talk about some of the key benefits of DrugPak software. We've got a very short video that we're going to play as well. That'll kind of, it's about a minute long. It's a nice recap. And then we'll take some time for questions and answers at the end. Again, as Jessica mentioned, if you have any questions as we're going on, just go ahead and put them in the chat. I will also alert you to the fact that we have 3 poll questions throughout. So there'll be a little bit of audience participation as we go along. Just some fun, fun things that we can ask and see how people are feeling about certain things. So with that, we will go ahead and get things rolling along. First thing, as we mentioned, we're going to kind of talk about the legal landscape. We'll look at state and federal, and again, really kind of concentrating on marijuana. So with the next slide, as we look to kind of where we were in 2024, just to give you guys a bigger picture level of how much activity is really going on. In 2024, there were actually more than 500 state level drug testing bills introduced. Now, not all of them actually came to fruition. Some of them didn't get very far. Some got further along but didn't pass in the end. But that's quite a lot of activity. Several states revised existing drug testing laws. So, you're sitting here saying probably, well, there's 50 states. That seems like very excessive. A lot of it are revisions to existing drug testing laws. Some of it are introductions of new ones. In case you're not aware, at the current consulting group, we actually have a state law database, and about once a month or so, we put up a newsletter called Leg Up. It's legislative update. It's a cute little acronym for that, called Leg Up, and it focuses on all of the legislation that's going through state, local, federal, and it kind of tells you where all the bills are being passed. So one of the things we did is we kind of looked at 2024 and said, what exactly, let's summarize everything. And so the key focus areas were oral fluid testing expansion. Not so surprising, given everything we've got going on with the DOT and oral fluid. But then also some of the things we'll get into a little more detail, but some of the laws in some states are really kind of pushing more towards recent use. And oral fluid is kind of a nice fit for that. So there were some mentions there. Medical recreational cannabis policy changes. So at this point, I think we have 42 states and/or Commonwealth, District of Columbia, so on and so forth, that have some sort of medical or recreational cannabis a law allowance for that. So a lot of times you'll see policy changes that come through. And then, following along the heels of that, employer drug testing compliance. So far, what we've seen in 2025, and we're now just about 9 months in, we've got even more activity going on with state legislative changes. So, again, we anticipate as we go into the end of this year and look towards 2026, when we look at 2025 as compared to 2024, it will be as busy, if not even busier than what we saw in 2024. So just a couple of examples. In 2024, Minnesota actually had 2 amendments, the first of which they amended their laboratory licensing laws to specifically permit the use of rapid result or point of care oral fluid devices. Up until this point, lab-based testing was all that was allowed from an oral fluid perspective, so they've opened that up to point of care. In 2025, they amended the medical marijuana law, which provides further employee protections. And you can see them here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read each of the bullets, but as Jessica said, you will get the slides along with the presentation. But there's a lot of, not only in Minnesota, but all over the United States, a lot of protections still for the employer. As marijuana friendly as we seem to be becoming, it still does not allow for marijuana use or misuse at work. And so employers are, allowed to try to have a safe workplace. And so there's still a lot of permissions that are taking place to allow for the ability to test, the ability to take disciplinary action, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please, Jessica. Other THC law updates. So just like oral fluid, rapid point of care was allowed in Minnesota, Alaska actually amended their voluntary law to permit oral fluid testing in August of 2024. We're not going to touch too much on voluntary versus mandatory laws here, but think about mandatory laws as something like the federal laws for HHS or for the DOT that mandate exactly what you must do from a drug testing perspective, what the panel looks like, what the cutoffs look like, what substances you can test for, how you can test. Voluntary laws are just that, and usually there's an incentive with those. Certain states will allow for a discount on your workers' compensation fees if you have a drug-free workplace and do drug tests. So that is what we're talking about here. It's a voluntary law that did not allow for oral fluid testing, but now does. And South Dakota passed a law permitting adverse employment action for marijuana positives for safety sensitive positions. We'll talk a little bit more about safety sensitive. It is a hot button, especially as we're talking about the federal carve out for the 1 to 3 and what that looks like or could look like. Again, it does not prevent an employer from trying to keep their workplace safe. And then Utah amended their marijuana law to prohibit adverse employment action based on medical marijuana positives without proof of impairment or use at work. Now, this does only apply to government and public employers. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. That is becoming a thing. I don't know how many folks are here from New York, but there are a lot of things going on in the state of New York where you can't take any action on medical marijuana positives or any positives without proof of impairment. We're seeing that in other states. We're seeing it in California. We're seeing it in Washington. We'll spend a little bit more time on that. But again, it's complicated and complex. And for those employers that operate in more than one state, it can be very confusing as well. So we'll try to weed through some of that. So next slide, please. Marijuana reschedule overview. So I'm not going to spend, this is the only slide we have on this. This is very much in flux right now. I think probably most people are aware of what's going on with the Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. But really quickly, so in 2024, the DEA basically proposed moving marijuana from Schedule 1 down to Schedule 3. For those that are not aware, there are actually 5 schedules, Schedule 1 being the most restrictive, Schedule 5 being the least restrictive. And so right now, marijuana sits at a Schedule 1, i.e. the most restrictive. There have been for years now, people that have wanted to declassify it down to a lower schedule, whether it's 2 or 3. Or you've even heard people say we're going to completely declassify it, meaning it wouldn't even fall into either schedule, anywhere from Schedule 1 to 5, and that really would mean federally it would become legal. So we're not talking about legalization from a federal perspective by moving it to Schedule 3, but what it will do is it will open up things like benefits for businesses, allowing businesses to take tax deductions, providing some financial relief, increase access to financial services like banking and loans. I think everybody probably knows that's a sticky subject right now because as it's federally illegal and Schedule 1, there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do with money. The other thing that would open up is it would open up looking at the use of marijuana from a medical perspective. Right now, because it's federal, it's classified as Schedule 1, it's very difficult to run studies to see what kind of medical impact it would have. And so that's a big part of the reason to move it to Schedule 3, to allow for research and studies to be able to be done to see if, from a medicine perspective, how it potentially could be used. The third bullet here, the move to Schedule 3, leaves uncertainty around federal and DOT testing. I want to spend a quick minute on this. So right now, the DOT specifically says that you can only test for substances that are on either Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. So what would happen here is if it moved to Schedule 3, the DOT would actually, by law, not be allowed to test for marijuana any longer. Think about what that means. Think about the people that are within the DOT pool that are being tested: airline pilots, railroad, anybody that's a CDL driver, truckers, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of discussion in our industry specifically about what the impact could possibly be if we move to Schedule 3. And how that could impact the safety of not only the people on the roads, but all of us from a personal perspective. So one of the things that's being proposed is, if it does go to Schedule 3, having a safety carve out that would very much still allow for the DOT to be able to test for marijuana. So it's yet to be seen what happens. President Trump did indicate in August that they were the timing, he really was looking within, he said, very soon, within weeks. Here we are at the end of September, we still haven't seen anything. So, we'll kind of see where this goes. But I encourage everyone that's on this call to just keep your eyes and ears out, because how this moves could have a tremendous impact on our industry, employers, the people that we work with, and testing in general. So with that, we will move on, and we're going to talk really quickly about federal versus state. Jessica, if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so federal versus state. So as I mentioned, and I think we all know, marijuana remains illegal under federal law. From a state perspective, some states do allow for, and this is primarily non-DOT, it does not matter if you are in a state that allows for legalized marijuana, either recreationally or medicinally. If you are in the DOT, you have to follow federal law, so that does not apply. So when we talk about state laws, for this purpose and for anything else really, we're really talking about non-DOT workplaces. As I mentioned, the employer has rights, but also the employee has rights regarding cannabis use, especially those that have medical cards. So some state laws allow for employee rights. Some of those rights, especially with the ADA, others basically have zero tolerance policies. So it will vary based on your state. Again, another reason to understand the laws and where you sit, not only in the state perhaps that you live in, but all of the states that you might do business in. Jessica, next slide, please. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about this slide, with the exception of it's very complex and very confusing in a way. And it changes all the time. Like I said before, 500 state laws had some kind of consequence in 2024, and we're looking at roughly the same, if not more, for this year. So, we've got this sort of categorized into 4 areas where it's not legal at all, and there's, just really a few states, and what the accommodations look like, where it's legal for medical, where it's legal for medical and recreational, and then kind of what discrimination would look like with or without a card, and what accommodations you have to have. So all of these states have some law that specifically guides an employer as to how they look at what they're doing about marijuana in their workplace. Again, it really behooves everyone that is on this call to understand exactly what the laws say and allow for in each of your states, so that if you're an employer, you understand that. If you are, a TPA or a collector or a lab that guides employers, that you know exactly what to do and how to say certain things. So with that, I think we have our first poll. Jessica will help guide us through that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jackie. So our first poll today asks, how confident are you in understanding your state's current marijuana testing laws? So I'm going to open up our poll for everyone who would like to participate. And just give me 1 second, it'll be up here. So if you would like to participate, your options are very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or not at all confident, which is a little less confident than not very confident. It looks like we're slowing down, so I'm going to close the poll and I'm going to share the results. And the results are that 33% of you feel very confident, 33% somewhat confident, 33% said not very confident. So that gives us a pretty even kill. I'm going to hide this. And I'm going to take us back over to our presentation. And Jackie, I'm going to let you go ahead and try moving the slides one more time. I may have fixed it.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. All right, so we are now going to move into kind of the top reasons for why people would want a drug testing policy or drug testing program. So some of you might be aware that we actually, Current Consulting Group does 2 surveys throughout the year, the first in the spring, the second in the fall. The first one in the spring is typically about, it really looks at the industry and asks the industry, and that includes manufacturers, it includes third-party administrators, labs, so on and so forth. So it's really the folks within the drug testing industry. A number of questions. And then the second one, which is in the fall, and we're actually getting ready, if anybody's going to be at SAPA in the next couple of weeks, we're getting ready to present the results at SAPA for the employer drug testing survey. And that's really looking at a group of employers. So not necessarily those in the industry that provide drug tests or drug testing results, but the actual employers. And so the 2024 employer drug testing survey, which was done in fall of 2024, it was co-sponsored by DrugPAC. And you'll see here, one of the things that we asked was what motivates companies to drug test. And you could see the top one here, 85% to promote workplace safety. Now that's down a little bit from the 2023 survey, just a couple of percentage points, but still very, very high, and honestly much higher than anything else here. The next 2 that I want to point out, 51% to hire the best possible job candidates, and then 49% to minimize legal risks. And then there's a group of 3 that I wanted to highlight. So 54% to comply with DOT regulations, 45% to comply with other federal regulations, and 36% to comply with state laws. So kind of to what we were talking about, there's a lot of laws and there's a lot of, you know, you must do drug testing and you must do it in this way. You know, and so we see a lot of that here. But again, keep in mind that the top vote getter was 85% to promote workplace safety. So all in all, it really is about keeping our workplaces safe as much as possible. So we're going to talk in a couple of sections a little bit more about the reasons for testing, but I just kind of want to put these up here because why you drug test often determines when or how or what the way that you're going to drug test. And so I think most people are probably very familiar with each of the reasons for testing: pre-employment, reasonable suspicion, post-accident. You can read the list here. We'll spend a little time talking about each one of these. But when you drug test, obviously pre-employment, you're going to do that before, you know, an offer of employment is actually given. Everything else that you see is what we call post-employment testing. So all of the other reasons here. And again, your policy really needs to specifically state how you're doing testing, when you're doing testing, who you're testing, so on and so forth. So really important to make sure that this is outlined in your policy. How does drug use impact the workplace? Everybody, I think these are kind of no-brainers, but there's some statistics and some things that I think are really interesting to keep in the front of our mind. You know, what we have seen, not only at Current Consulting Group, but within the industry, we have seen a number of employers just drop drug testing altogether. They've dropped THC from their panel in some cases, and in others, you know, just have dropped it altogether. You know, keeping a safe workplace, as we said, is really important. So why is it important? You know, if you drop it, increase workplace accidents, You could lower workplace productivity, employee morale, and one of the most important things is exposing the employer to lawsuits. If you know something could be going on and you're not doing anything about it, you can very much be held liable for that. So some of the things that we have to think about is as our world opens up for legal drug use, specifically legal cannabis, we really need to think about how that is going to impact the workplace as far as drug testing. So a couple of statistics in the 2024 drug testing industry survey, that's the one I mentioned that comes out in the springtime. 59% of participants said they believe the decision to discontinue testing for marijuana and actually encourages employees to consume marijuana before work. There was an independent study, some of you may have seen this, Hound Labs, who was looking to get a THC breathalyzer commercialized, did a survey of it was actually over 500 employed marijuana users. So it was a very specific survey with a subset of people that actually said, I work and I smoke marijuana. And they asked them a number of questions, and that we put 2 of them here. 31% admitted to using marijuana on their way to the workplace, and 48% admitted to using marijuana at work. And that included during breaks or actively working. So for those employers that say, A, I don't have a drug problem at work, or B, I'm not going to test, I don't need to. I mean, here's a very explicit subset of people that actually are employed and use marijuana. And this is marijuana on a daily basis, by the way. And you can see the percentages here. There was another survey conducted by the American Addiction Centers where about 22.5% of the individuals who admit to being current drug users say they use during the workday. So a little bit lower, but very similar percentages. And another one that says 40% of people who work from home full-time say they have gotten high before and during work hours. So we tend to a lot of times think about safety sensitive operations, people working in a production plant or, in construction or mining or something like that. But we have a lot of people that are actually working from home, reviewing legal documents, working on financials, and you've got, a statistic like this. So again, kind of more reasons to continue to think about why drug testing is still critical today. Obviously I just talked about construction and manufacturing and production. So more drug users, more accidents, so when you think about, more workers testing positive generally and specifically for marijuana, that just means more drug impaired workers on the job and more accidents. The Quest Drug Testing Index, that is sort of the Bible out there as far as statistics and what's going on, what drugs are being used, how much they're being used, where they're being used. So they quoted over the last 5 years in the general US workforce that post-accident positivity increased about 23%. And as compared to pre-employment tests, both for marijuana and cocaine in the general US workforce, it was higher by about 59% and 230% respectively. Also looked at post-accident positivity for marijuana among federally mandated sensitive population, and we see that increasing as well. And remember, from a federal perspective, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. You must test for marijuana. It is, at least at this point, still on the mandated list, yet that's increasing as well. So why continue to drug test? When you think about, again, kind of putting some percentages and numbers, 55% more industrial accidents, 85% more injuries, 75% greater absenteeism. National Safety Conference or Council, which if anyone is familiar with NSC, the National Safety Congress, that's kind of in the US, are guiding the look at, safety in general for all workplaces. And they looked at, just cognitive and psychomotor skills, and really, said that there's no level of cannabis use that is safe at work or for people in safety sensitive positions. I think we all know this, but to see these percentages kind of hits home in a lot of cases, especially bringing back those statistics that I mentioned at the beginning of this section about how many marijuana users are actually using while on the job. But it's also more than marijuana. You know, opiates, when you think, I always think about somebody that has a prescription for some sort of an opiate, and on that prescription it says, do not drive or operate heavy machinery. And I think a lot of us think about getting in a car, but you know, that forklift or that production, you know, line, something like that, you know, you are, what do opiates do? They sort of, you know, they make you not feel pain, and while they're doing that, you certainly do feel a little bit different. So, you know, we do need to be thinking about opiates. A lot of people that have, you know, chronic pain, whether it be a back injury, a leg injury, something like that, do work actively in construction, in manufacturing, in production. And so we need to be cognizant of that as well. So as you start looking at some of, you know, these statistics, workers in Massachusetts who reported a job-related injury in the past 10 years were 35% more likely to have died of an opioid-related overdose. Boston Department of Public Health they looked at data from 2011 to 2020, and over 4,300 workers, 17%, 741, died from an opioid-related overdose. More than 28% of the workers who died from that overdose were employed in construction and extraction, 11% transportation and material moving, and 7% food prep and serving related jobs. So, you know, it's everywhere. And again, we need to be thinking beyond just marijuana, but, you know, drugs in general. And again, kind of coming back to dropping drug testing from your policy, when you see all these statistics, it is kind of scary that we have people that continue to just ignore the fact that they should be continuing to drug test. So with that, Jessica, that brings us to poll number 2, if you want to help with that.
Yeah, let's do this. Okay, poll number 2 says, which testing reason is most challenging for your organization to manage effectively? So I'm going to pop that up there for us so that we can participate. And your input is appreciated: pre-employment, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, random, return to duty, follow-up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share the results. And it looks like 9% said pre-employment, 45% said reasonable suspicion, 27% said post-accident. No one is having trouble with random or finding that challenging. 18% said return to duty or follow-up. So I will hide these results and mute my mic.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I think, you know, coming into our next section, it will be interesting to kind of see how that plays out a little bit, because we're going to talk a little more about the reasons for testing. So kind of going through some of those. So when we get to reasonable suspicion, you know, I think sometimes it's not as black and white, you know, and when you look at some of the states with some new laws now regarding, you know, impairment and not actually being able to, you know, take any action based on a drug test solely, that there's got to be this level of impairment or some level of suspicion. It is a gray area. And I think part of the issue really is, as an employer, you know, what are my rights? Am I going to get sued? Am I allowed to do this? Is it legal? Lots of questions around it. So not honestly surprising to me that reasonable suspicion was the, you know, the higher one that we saw. So let's get into best practices for and the methodologies. You know, kind of, we're going to pair some, you know, here's why you test with some of the ways to test. So this section will be a little more expanded to talk about both the technology as well as testing reasons. So as we kind of start going through, we're going to touch on all of these that are on the right side: pre-employment, random, for cause, post-accident, return to duty, and follow-up. But think about why you are testing, because there's varying reasons of, you know, for why you do some of these things. Do you want to capture recent drug use or long-term lifestyle? And that's a really good question, because technologies are a little bit different. You know, if you're looking for a longer term lifestyle, and just, you know, preempting everything, hair testing is probably a good way to go, given that it goes out 90 days. But it's not going to tell you anything recent, because it actually, you can't even find drugs for the first 7 to 10 days in a hair test. Vice versa, on recent drug use, if you're looking for a very specific window of time, you're not going to look, you know, again, at hair testing, you might look at a different methodology, whether it be breath or blood or oral fluid, and then urine kind of sits somewhere in between. So, you know, what is it you're looking to accomplish? And that will kind of guide you to what testing method is a good one to use. Do you want immediate results, or are you okay sending samples to a lab? Thinking about point of care testing, you get immediate results there, typically within 5 to 10 minutes. Is that something, are you having, for pre-employment as an example, are you having a wellness fair or a hiring fair and you want to have results very quickly? Are you a drug-free workplace and need 20 workers to hired for a second shift, and you don't have the time to wait for a lab? Those are really good reasons to think about point of care testing. Or, you know, is it okay to send the specimen to the lab and wait the 1 to 3 days for the results? How quickly do you need those results back? What's the rationale behind it? So again, you know, thinking about the what you're testing for, which of these areas you're testing for, will kind of dictate what makes the most sense. And one thing that I should say is, you know, it's not a one size fits all. It's not, let's test for one type of, you know, urine only, oral fluid only, hair only. So many of the people that we talk to are kind of mixing it up. And there's lots of reasons for that. And we'll talk about that as we kind of go through this section here. But just keep that in the back of your mind. It doesn't have to just be one kind of technology that you're using. You can certainly mix them up. Do you want to focus only on the bottom line? And so the reason this one is here is because there is a cost differential between sometimes lab-based tests or expanded panels that you might be using versus a point of care test. There might be a cost difference between if you don't have the facilities and you're using urine testing and you have to use a third-party site, a collection site that typically will charge you for an Occ Health clinic. They're going to charge you a little bit more versus, you know, could you do a point of care test? Does it make sense to do that? And then kind of you cut out not having to use a third-party facility. So you can save a little bit, possibly save a little bit of money there. So if expense is an issue, then you might be considering one type of test versus another. And are you required to test? And if so, by whom? Also really important. Are you part of the DOT? Are you part of the federal regulations of the NRC? Well, then, like I said before, you really don't have a choice. You're going to be told exactly what panel, what drugs, what cutoff level, and how you can test, whether it's lab-based or point of care, which, by the way, no point of care is allowed in the federal. Can you use urine? Can you use hair? Can you use oral fluid? Can you use some other methodologies? So, you know, again, knowing kind of what you're required to do. State law might also dictate, as we talked about before. So if you are mandated to test, if it's mandatory testing, you have to be really careful and cognizant about checking all those local laws as well as state laws and so on and so forth. So lots to think about as you think about why you're testing, as we kind of transition into, you know, how and so on and so forth. So again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these in the interest of time, but you'll have these slides. I think a lot of people probably know a lot of these reasons already, but pre-employment testing, as I mentioned before, that is before an offer is, you know, is actually out officially to the potential employee. Many states may be restricted to just post-offer situations. So also be sure in your state, either that you're operating in or any of the states you operate in, that you understand the rules of engagement around pre-employment testing, what you're allowed to do or not. For instance, you can see here, Nevada limits testing to within the first 30 days of employment and cannot refuse to hire someone because of a cannabis positive test. New York, as an example, and we'll go into that in a little bit, prohibits nearly all testing for cannabis. Philadelphia prohibits pre-employment cannabis testing, including safety sensitive. It does include a safety sensitive carve out. And that's important because in some places like New York, actually, there is no safety sensitive carve out. Doesn't matter what you're doing, how you're doing it. For the most part, you cannot do pre-employment testing for cannabis in New York City, New York State, actually. And then other states are kind of, coming on the bandwagon and considering legislation that would do the same thing. So again, that's why it's really important to understand what your state is saying. And even if you think you know what it's saying, always be checking to make sure there's not an update to the law, because there are, as we've talked about, lots of updates. Random testing. This is probably, and I think the fact that we had 0 people thinking about, how difficult that might be. This is probably one of the most straightforward, especially anyone that is working within the federal government in some way, shape, or form. So random testing is dictated in many circumstances with the DOT or different modalities. You know that you must test X% of your employee base on a yearly basis. The DOT comes out, with their updated percentages for Coast Guard and for, the pipelines and airlines and so on and so forth. And it can vary from year to year. If you didn't know, it's actually based on the positivity rate from the prior year. That's how they set it. If the positivity rate comes down, they typically will lower the percentage of random drug testing that's required. If it goes up, they will typically increase it, keep it the same or increase it. But obviously randomly, that's a really important thing. Random is random. It shouldn't be, favoritism or anything like that. So it's really important to understand how a structured random program is set in so that you're not being accused of being biased towards one person or another. Hey, Johnny came up 3 times and, Betsy came up 7 times. Like, how is that possible? So really important that you're using appropriate tools as you're going through your random testing. Reasonable suspicion, again, as we talked about, this is probably one of the most complex because it really is, taking place while we're thinking that somebody could be under the influence. The other complicated thing about reasonable suspicion is there are a lot of reasons that somebody could be underperforming in a job. And some of them could be related to drug or alcohol use, but some could be related to stress, not enough sleep, fatigue, so on and so forth. So what we're starting to see, and while we don't really have anything in this presentation, we are starting to see kind of general impairment tests coming up that are really looking at, is the employee performing things a little bit different than maybe they have in the past? And not necessarily jumping right to maybe they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, but doing a general kind of impairment test first and then reflexing to drug or alcohol if needed. So there's a lot of nuances to reasonable suspicion. And so that again is sort of, I think, why there's a little more confusion around it. And then that last bullet is really important. Some states may require written documentation of observed signs of reasonable suspicion. One of the important elements that you need to be thinking about in your program is making sure that you are trained, your employees, your supervisors are trained for signs and symptoms, and that falls right in line with reasonable suspicion, is making sure that you really understand, what constitutes somebody that could possibly, have justification for reasonable suspicion. Post-accident, this one's pretty clear mostly. Usually, okay, by definition, drug or alcohol takes place in the testing that takes place after an accident. But there's a lot of nuances here as well. So specific definition of what constitutes an accident. OSHA has their own view on certain things. So sometimes you've got state law, sometimes you've got OSHA you have to worry about. So again, really make sure that you understand exactly what the requirements are for post-accident testing. I remember a number of years ago, can't remember what state it was, but there was a lot of discussion around well, you know, there has to be, it has to be a pretty big accident, or like it has to, it can't be somebody that cut their finger, like had a paper cut, right? So because that could be construed as trying to get somebody, you know, fired or something like that. So again, there's a lot of rules and regulations around what constitutes drug testing, a drug or alcohol testing related incident as far as post-accident testing is concerned. And so that's really important to understand. And then there's some other types of testing here, periodic exam testing, return to duty, follow-up. Follow-up testing, if you get involved in that, make sure you are working with a substance abuse professional, SAPs. They really help kind of guide you through and so on and so forth. There's other types of testing that people may do from a post-employment perspective. If somebody's promoted, transferred, reassigned, that may trigger another drug test. Again, all of this needs to be in your policy. Really, really important that it is in your policy, it's called out. Just real quick, value of post-hire testing, making sure that you're identifying drug users in the workplace, that you've got a safe and compliant workplace. You know, cost and savings benefits as accidents are reduced, productivity stays up. Another big one, deterring drug testers from applying. You know, that's a big one. Once they know what you're being tested for, they tend to go somewhere that is not testing. Workers' comp and unemployment compensation denial benefits. This is a big one. It costs a lot of money for a company to go into, you know, any kind of these. So it's really important when you think about how you're testing, what you're testing. And then the value of random testing as well. And this kind of plays into, you know, almost 30% of illicit drug using employees saying they would be less likely to work for employers who conduct random drug testing. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. They don't want to get caught. But the inverse of that is, you know, if you are not using drugs, you would prefer to work for a company that, you know, does random testing. Drug testing methodology. So thinking about, you know, what are you looking for when you're choosing a drug testing method? And we talked a little bit about lab versus point of care, flexibility, drug testing panel options. As an example, if you're using a lab, you can pretty much tell them, hey, I want to test for X. 1 drug, 5 drugs, 20 drugs, whatever it is, you can change it up between your employees. There's a lot of flexibility there. With a point of care test, you're kind of relegated to what is the menu on that test. And so you might have to have a variety of different point of care products that are there. Let's say you're doing urine testing. You know, if you want a 5-panel or an 8-panel, you're going to have a box of 5 and a box of 8 and a box of 10. So you kind of do have to, you've got to really understand what is the panel that you're looking for. And if you need flexibility, then maybe a point of care option isn't right for you. Accuracy, also really important. Can't stress it enough especially when you're looking at point of care products. Talk with the manufacturer, understand what their package insert says, what does their performance data look like, so on and so forth. State laws, we talked a lot about that. Window of detection, we're going to get into in a minute. Really important to kind of understand the different methodologies, how long you might see a positive test for, so on and so forth. So with that, we're going to focus on really 3 primary sample types: urine, oral fluid, and hair. We're not, because we're talking about workplace testing, we're not really going to focus on blood. Blood is very rarely seen in the workplace market. It's complex, and you know, it just we typically don't see it. So we're really going to focus on the other 3, and then we'll talk about instant, rapid tests, sometimes called point of care, and laboratory-based testing. So really quick, if you've not seen this window of detection slide before, really important to understand, and it's you know, it's sort of a busy chart, but basically what you're looking for is across the bottom, how long you would expect to see a positive rate or a positive test. And what you can see here is, depending on the methodology, it could be a very short amount of time, it could be a midpoint of time, or a very long point of time. So as you can see here, when you're looking at breath, blood, and oral fluid, you can see pretty much immediately after ingestion, all 3 of those will be able to detect drugs in a person's system. What you see the difference here is how far out they go. So breath typically, there's, let me be clear, not a official commercially available breath test on the market. Hound, as I mentioned before, was looking to commercialize a product. They have kind of pulled back for right now, and I think they're redesigning, but they're not commercially available. Cannabix is another one that's looking. They may be in some pilot programs right now, but we don't actively have a commercial breath product out there. The hope is that we will soon, but right now we don't. But there's a lot of studies that have gone on between those two companies and others about how long you can actually detect a positive test with breath. And the answer seems to be somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. So that's kind of the extent there. Blood goes out a little bit longer. Oral fluid goes out, and it does say days, and I will preface that by saying with THC, it will be a shorter time frame than many of the other drugs. So in general, we kind of had to lump everything here. Urine starts a little bit later. It takes a while for the body to metabolize. So those first couple of minutes, you're not gonna, I'm sorry, first couple of hours, you won't get a positive test, but it goes out a little bit further. And then hair, as I mentioned before, you're looking at 7 to 10 days before you'd even see a positive test for hair, but it does go out months, typically up to about 90 days. And that's really important as you start thinking about all the different methodologies. Really quick, because I know we're running out of time. So lab-based urine testing, a couple of the pros I want to point out: considered the gold standard. It's been around for 40-something years. Very much available. It is one of only 2 permitted specimens for DOT, oral fluid being the other. Supported in most states, withstood legal challenges. It's been around the block for a long time. Some of the cons, biggest one probably is adulteration. It is one of the testing methods that consistently, it's easy to beat. And you know, and that's part of the reason the DOT looked at oral fluid, because it's much more difficult to adulterate an oral fluid test. So that's one of the biggest cons. Instant urine testing, point of care testing, lots of different products. Again, it's been out for a long time, both lab and point of care. Lots of panel configurations, lots of manufacturers that are out there. Some of the cons, one con that this is really for any point of care product, lab confirmation is still required. So what that means is if you've got a presumptive positive, now what you're doing is you've got to take that product, send it into the lab, and now wait another 1, 2, 3, 5 days to get your confirmation. So that is something to consider from that perspective. And all, as I mentioned before, all both the oral fluid and urine rapid tests are not allowed for DOT. Also in some states. One of the other things to think about with these, the visual reads, so without a reader, sometimes it's, is there a line, isn't there a line? So there is that to consider. When you think about alternative methods, so we'll talk a little bit about oral fluid and hair. Oral fluid remains the best testing methodology for detecting recent use, and hair for kind of life habits, just again, based on the fact that it goes out 90 days. So, you know, those are things to be thinking about. So lab-based oral fluid, as I mentioned, adulteration is nearly impossible. You can collect anytime, anywhere, and it is approved for federal use. Caveat, 2 labs need to be certified in order for samples to be received. We're not quite there yet, but the bottom line, it is approved for federal use. From a con perspective, there are 2 states that's not allowed, but that's important if you are in those 2 states. And inventory management, again, like a point of care product, you've got to have the collection device to be able to use. So there's some considerations there. Instant oral fluid testing, really, again, the same thing with urine. You know, you get your results quickly, you can collect anytime, anywhere. And then the one thing I will say here we have as a con is there are fewer FDA cleared devices. There's E&I, and that's a whole different discussion. But if you need an FDA cleared device, there's a lot of them on the urine side. There are not that many on the oral fluid side. And while E&I testing is available in the workplace, you can't use it for clinical or hospital settings and things like that. So it is something to think about. Hair testing, again, some of the pros, you know, you don't have to worry about gender collection issues because you're not watching somebody urinate in a cup. But some of the cons, it is not SAMHSA approved yet. It is going through the process, but it is not quite there yet. And then some standardization issues and some controversy, perceived controversy. I think we've gotten past a lot of that, but there are some issues that we have there. How state laws are responding to legalization and what you can do. We don't have a lot of time to run through this section. What I will say is California and Washington have really kind of taken the lead on this whole psychoactive, non-psychoactive discussion on cannabis. If you're not aware of what that means, it really means that testing is still permitted, but you must use the psychoactive version or metabolite, or the psychoactive version of marijuana. So you can't use non-psychoactive. And so non-psychoactive pretty much limits you. You can't use urine. And there are some other methods that you can't use. You can use oral fluid. And so that's why when you look at this slide, have you had clients add or switch to oral fluid because of laws in California and Washington? We have seen the number of people say that they have, and a good 63% of those that have switched to oral fluid. And there's a reason and a rationale for that. So California is very specific about how you can test. It prohibits discrimination. It must indicate the presence of the psychoactive component. So urine tests do not, oral fluid tests do. And so you really have to worry. You've got to think about a urine screen. If you're using urine in California, you could be at risk because the law really tells you that you can't. This really kind of looks at California, what you're allowed to do. New York, as I mentioned, New York has its own law about what you can or can't do. And so there are some issues there around not being able to test for marijuana for pre-employment. There's no safety carve out. So very important if you're in New York to understand the rules and regulations. Washington also has a carve out, and it talks about pre-employment testing, that you have to be very careful about what you're doing, and hiring decisions can be based only on scientifically valid drug screening that do not screen, again, for the non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites. So urine testing not allowed in Washington. Again, if you live California, Washington, really important to understand the laws in both of those states. And that's why a lot of people are talking about oral fluid testing, because it does detect the active THC parent and allows for that psychoactive test to take place. Not just California and Washington, lots of other states are looking at it. And again, like all of these things, you have to be careful about what's in your policy, what's stated in your policy, making sure that you understand the laws, the regulations, and it's written in your policy. Don't think we're going to have a whole lot of time, Jessica, to get to the drug pack side. Do we have maybe a minute to just put the video up for everybody?
Sure. Yeah, we understand that we're at the top of the hour, so we respect your time, but we do have a really nice video from DrugPak that tells you a little bit about the software that they offer. And so I'm going to go ahead and share that with those who can stay with us for just another minute, and then we'll wrap this up. So let's go ahead and I will share that with you all.
you very much, Jessica. And so I think with that, I know that we do have one question in the chat that I'm looking at really quickly that I could address very quick. My company performs non-DOT testing all over the country. Can you recommend a reliable source that provides drug testing laws, restrictions, and protections for each state? And so the easy answer to that question is Kern Consulting Group. We actually have a state law database that has all of that information. We have subscriptions to it. You can buy subscriptions for just one state or multiple states or the entire country. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please get in touch and we'd be happy to talk more with you about that. Jessica, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie, for taking us through that information. Thank you for DrugPak for sponsoring today's webinar presentation and for sharing that video with us. If you'd like to book a free guided demo trial with a demo tailored to your specific needs, you can go to this website and schedule, or you can reach out to sales@drugpak.com. Thank you, Jackie, for helping us with that question. If you have any other questions about today's presentation, the information that was discussed, or about DrugPak, you can reach out to Kern Consulting Group or DrugPak. Again, this presentation did qualify for SHRM credits for attending the live presentation, and we'll send you out that information as well as a link to the recording. And with that, that concludes today's presentation, and we thank you for your time and for joining us today. Have a great day, and we will see you on the next webinar.